The Anschluss is one of the most misunderstood events in recent history. Even historians agreed on a false narrative for a decade or two after the war, before the true facts came out. To some people, it's an extension of German unification, a perfectly valid union of two German countries. To others, it's the beginning of Hitler's evil plan to conquer most of Europe, or even, in some cases, the world. The reality is that the Anschluss is a rather complex issue. Today, Austria is expressly forbidden to join with Germany again. Not that that's a real issue on the cards at the moment. Both Germany and Austria are now extremely modern nations. On a personal level, Austria has the best infrastructure I've ever seen in my entire life. At the time, however, this was rather different. The Treaty of Versailles left Austria alone and without her empire, a tiny state with crippling issues right from the get-go. Almost immediately, the Anschluss idea rose to the forefront as a way out. With no Habsburg Empire anymore, the entire reason for Austria remaining independent of a unified Germany was out of the window. In 1938, with a resurgent Germany under Adolf Hitler, the locals were clamouring for a union with Germany harder than they ever had before, and they got their wish. The crisis was not precipitated by Hitler, as even many historians have wrongly noted, but by Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg, who tried, and failed, to gamble with keeping his country independent. People give Adolf Hitler far too much credit. Due to the brutality of the war, people, perhaps understandably, assume that he was some kind of mastermind with an evil plan. This simply is not the case. Hitler was often reacting to events, rather than acting himself. The Second Czech Crisis and the Anschluss both fell directly into his lap. Hitler's ideology was in a way based on the determination that eventually windows would open and opportunities would arrive. His desire to be reunited with Austria, his homeland, was no secret, but he had no grand plan to unite them, only the determination that one day it would happen. Often he was proved right. Sheer willpower, waiting for the right moment, and gambling resulted in him getting exactly what he wanted right up until September 1939. So let's look at what really happened. It's such a big topic that I suppose this video is a two-in-one. It is a part of the Hitler series, but at the same time, it's its own thing altogether, like the hour-long SS video. As always though, if you prefer to start this series from the beginning, then the link will be in the description, or on my channel homepage, but in this case especially, this video works perfectly fine as a standalone video. And again, as always, a disclaimer. This video is about a highly controversial topic, on top of the already controversial topic of Adolf Hitler. The video is in no way political, however, and I strongly advise you not to read too much into it. I am simply going over the facts of what happened, and will give no opinion of my own. My sources will be in the description. Please be normal, thank you. Finally, before we begin, a huge thank you to my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube subscribers who keep this channel afloat. The channel is almost purely ran on donations, and without them, there is no channel. So if you do enjoy these videos, want to join our Discord, our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, or our new Minecraft server, then please do consider clicking the links in the description. Even the $2 tier is extremely helpful. Thank you. On the 2nd of June 1919, the Austrian delegation arrived at Saint-Germain outside of Paris to receive their peace terms after their defeat in the Great War. These delegates represented the new Austria, which was barely a fraction of the size of what the formerly great Austro-Hungarian Empire had been. Even before 1919, the empire was on the way out, as were all empires, even if the British and the French hadn't realised this yet. Hungary had always been a somewhat unwilling partner in the empire, despite its inclusion in the name, perhaps suggesting otherwise. The dual monarchy was only ever a compromise to paper over the cracks. The Hungarians were but the strongest minority wanting their independence. Within the empire's borders, you had Czechs, Serbs, Croatians, Poles, Ruthenians, Romanians, Slovakians, Slovenians, and even Italians, among others, all wanting independence or to return to their true ethnic states in the Italian and Romanian case. In order to successfully gain independence, you generally need a crisis, and in 1914, the biggest crisis in history up until that point suddenly erupted, seemingly out of nowhere. Now, almost immediately, all the paper which had covered the empire's cracks began to disintegrate. By war's end, the empire had imploded, and the separate nation-states that remained were firmly in the Allied camp. There was now one looming question: who to punish? Surely it couldn't be these new nation-states, who, according to the nation-states themselves, were always on the Allied side, despite the reality that obviously all these ethnic groups fought on both sides, be it by choice or by force. This left Austria, and, by extension, confusingly, Hungary, who was punished far harder than Austria, to pay the bill. The new Austrian state turned up to Versailles hoping to avoid this, but the reality was, someone had to pay the debts. Karl Renner, the new Austrian chancellor, said to the Allies, quote, "We stand before you as one of the parts of the vanquished and fallen empire. In the same way as the other nation-states, our republic, too, has sprung to life. Consequently, she can no more than the former be considered the successor to the late monarchy." End quote. Whilst many British legal experts agreed, many did not. Most of all, the Italians, who hoped to gain whatever they could at Austria's expense during the conference, much to the annoyance of their allies. British Prime Minister Lloyd George quite liked the Austrians and bore them no particular hostility. French Prime Minister Clemenceau's brother was even married to an Austrian. In Margaret Macmillan's book, Peacemakers, she describes post-war Austria better than I can. Quote, "Unlike Germany or Hungary, Austria was too small and too poor to be a threat. It had no strong sense of nationalism, for it had never been a country, only part of the Habsburg lands. In 1919, it was a strange, misshapen orphan with a tiny body and a huge head. The German-speaking lands, with their picturesque and impoverished mountains and valleys, and the former imperial capital of Vienna, whose magnificent palaces, vast offices, grand avenues, parade grounds, cathedrals, and churches were built for the rulers of 50 million subjects, not 5 million. We have thousands more officials than we need," the Prime Minister complained to a sympathetic American, "and at least 200,000 workmen. It is a fearful question to know what to do with them." Half the population of Austria lived in the city, but there was little left to support them. End quote. In short, Austria was the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but a heart cannot really function without the rest of the body. Now it was a state without direction, left to find its own way. Almost immediately, problems arose. One of the more pressing ones was hunger. The flow of supplies that once came down the Danube now stopped. The coal and potatoes from Bohemia didn't arrive, nor did the beef and wheat from Hungary. Austria couldn't afford to buy them from anywhere, and no one felt generous enough to give them any. In fact, many of their neighbours were too busy trying to help in the carve-up and taking whatever they could. One example is Italy, who put in claims for works of art which had been taken to Vienna before Italy ever even existed. The country was in a sorry state. In Vienna alone, there was 125,000 unemployed. The countryside was a barren wasteland, the livestock had all been used up, shops were empty, and disease was rife. Even middle-class girls sold themselves into prostitution in order to eat, and starving children lined the streets begging for a morsel of food. An American observer reported, quote, "Their whole attitude was very much like that of a people who had suffered from some great natural calamity, such as a flood or famine. Their attitude and their arguments were very much like those of a delegation seeking help for the famine sufferers of India, and there was a complete assumption that we were free from resentment and filled with a sympathetic desire to put them on their feet." End quote. Another visitor, this one being a British civil servant named William Beveridge, remarked that if there was not immediate relief given to Austria, there could be complete social collapse. The provinces were not able to send food to Vienna, and things were quickly turning for the worst. Worse than all of these, people had been ripped from their fellow countrymen and had been assigned to other nations, with no regard for how the Austrians themselves felt about it. The Italians took South Tyrol. The Czechs took 3 million ethnic Germans with them in the awkwardly placed Sudetenland region. In total, this amounted to 2/5 of the Austrian population. The Austrians, quite rightly, were furious. After all, wasn't this peace supposed to be about Wilson's famous self-determination principle? Where was the plebiscite for the Austrians? As a result, the Austrians were devoid of hope, but amongst this depression, an idea arose: the Anschluss. Chancellor Renner recalled, quote, "The fear of famine and unemployment, and the sudden contraction of the field for enterprise, made nearly everyone think of the Anschluss as the only possible solution." End quote. And it wasn't just the people as a whole. On the 12th of November, the day after the war ended, the Austrian government passed a resolution in favour of uniting with Germany and immediately opened negotiations with their northern brothers. Only a small fraction of the population held reservations, mostly on religious and cultural grounds. The fear was that Austria's unique Catholic heritage might get swallowed up by the Protestant North, but the reality was that a massive percentage of the German population was Catholic, and seemed to be getting along just fine, especially Bavaria, who shared by far the most cultural similarities to the Austrians. Both sides during the negotiations were cautious, however. The Austrians wanted their unique character to be respected. The Germans didn't want to annoy the peacemakers in Versailles before they received their terms. If they gained land in the south, the Allies would be more willing to take land in the east and west, they quite rightly reasoned. The time didn't seem to be right for the union, and the Allies promptly banned any such union, mostly at the wishes of the French. French representatives in Austria, even before this, had warned Austria not to go ahead with such a union. If they did so, they said, their terms would not be so benevolent. As a result, clearly, the union didn't go ahead, as the two countries had no means of pushing it through without extremely heavy repercussions. The Anschluss was dead, but not buried. Interwar Austria was in a strange position. They got on with things, but it was a confused little country. Mussolini's Italy saw it as its buffer state against Germany, and as a result, the nation drifted politically towards fascism in terms of the ruling class, but the people themselves drifted towards National Socialism in the north. Inflation post-war was extremely rough, but eventually, the nation managed to get a handle on things. The Great Depression, however, was another matter. Austria got absolutely rocked by the after effects of the Wall Street crash, and in May 1931, the biggest bank in the country collapsed. Once again, a mini Anschluss came up as a solution in the form of a customs union with Germany, but again, they were denied. The following year, Engelbert Dollfuss of the Christian Social Party took power, and the nation quickly slid into a dictatorship. Now, you had the peculiar situation of Dollfuss, a fascist, ruling over a nation which was rapidly becoming more and more National Socialist. Dollfuss argued that Austria must remain separate for the sake of preserving their unique identity, most of all, their Catholicism. But again, given that so many Germans were happily living as Catholics, this could often come off as more of a front for him wanting to preserve his own power. On the other hand, you had the Austrian National Socialists, who sought to be united with Germany when Hitler came to power, an event which was seeming increasingly inevitable. Less than a year later, Hitler was Chancellor. Mussolini down south offered endless support to Dollfuss, and the two were on great terms politically and socially. They appeared to be natural friends. Regardless, what Dollfuss wanted, and what the public wanted, continued to widen, although for now, his position was safe. As Hitler continued to move from strength to strength up north, however, Dollfuss's position became increasingly difficult, as he desperately tried to keep a lid on things. In 1934, the issues would erupt to the surface in the form of a civil war. The Civil War was ultimately a dismal failure, and it could barely be called a civil war at all due to its tiny, unorganized scale, but it showed the direction things were heading. As a result of the uprising, Dollfuss cracked down hard, and Hitler chose to keep a safe distance from the situation. Jumping in and invading simply wasn't Hitler's style. As always, he would wait for the opportunity with his feet up, and let the Austrians choose their own future, as it was clear which way the wind was blowing, even if Dollfuss had not yet realised this. In May, a one-party state was declared, and the official title of the state was changed from the Republic of Austria to the Federal State of Austria, as well as the flag, the coat of arms, and the national anthem. Dollfuss was forming his own unique dictatorship. It was clear that he and his variation of fascism, known as Austrofascism, was declaring war on National Socialism, and the crackdowns only increased after the one-party state was announced, which was rather understandable, given that if he didn't act, the National Socialists would eventually come to power under a democratic system. Sadly for Dollfuss, however, the National Socialists had quite a different idea in mind. Their response to the crackdowns was to simply get rid of Dollfuss, the only one who could ever really stand in the way of their rise to power. On the 25th of July, 1934, 154 Austrian SS men marched right into the Chancellery, disguised as soldiers, and shot Dollfuss dead. The killer was a man named Otto Planetta. He himself would be executed in the events to come, but he went on to become something much bigger for the Austrian Nazis and the Germans up north. He was now an Austrian martyr to National Socialism, in the same vein as those Germans who had fell in the failed beer hall putsch in 1923 in Munich had been. In the end, the assassination was successful, but the coup was not. A couple hundred people died in all on both sides, and 13 were executed for their role in things, including Planetta. 4,000 rebels were thrown into prison, including many police officers. Many more simply fled into hiding in neighbouring countries, including Yugoslavia or Germany itself. Hitler, on the other hand, was absolutely livid, and he flew into a rage. It was evident that almost immediately he would be blamed, despite the reality being quite the opposite. And still to this day, he is often blamed, although most historians clearly recognise the truth in this matter in recent times. Down south, Mussolini too came to the same conclusion, and he had the unfortunate task of telling Dollfuss's family, who were currently staying with him at the time for a visit, about the Chancellor's death. he immediately ordered troops up to the Brenner Pass and offered Austria full support in case of a German invasion. When he initially got the news, he said, quote, "Hitler is the murderer of Dollfuss. Hitler is the guilty man. He is responsible for this." And he flew into a rage about all things Hitler, from the Führer's personal life all the way down to National Socialism in general, or the Germans as a race. Luckily for Europe, war did not break out, and Hitler never had any intention of doing so. In fact, when he heard that there was negotiations for the murderers of Dollfuss to be sent to Germany, he went berserk. Bülow, the man he was on the phone with, recounts, quote, "The Reich Chancellor replied that he would have the expelled conspirators taken into protective custody and transferred to a concentration camp," end quote. Hitler then had the Vienna office of the party closed and tried to distance himself from the Austrian Nazis even further. The man chosen to replace Dollfuss was Kurt Schuschnigg. The crisis was only just beginning, however, and Kurt had quite the task on his hands. In 1937, Neville Chamberlain came to power in England and immediately set to work on finding an understanding with Hitler. Chamberlain, and many others at the time, including the general public in Great Britain, were beginning to see some logic in Hitler's arguments. The Great War propaganda had worn off with time, and in general, Versailles was seen as harsh and cruel. The most hated aspect was the lack of self-determination given to the Germans, which was at the end of the day, the entire reason that they made peace. Germans had been lumped into Denmark, Belgium, France, and Italy. These, Hitler was willing to write off. Sure, he would prefer them at home, but it simply wasn't worth the trouble. These countries were all stable and safe. The Germans got along well enough, except in maybe Italy's case, where they were being Italianized by Mussolini, but Hitler was happy enough to write them off, much to the annoyance of some in the party, in order to appease Mussolini. The problem wasn't in Denmark, Belgium, France, and Italy, however. It was in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Lithuania. The Austrians had been refused their wishes of an Anschluss. The Czechs had absorbed 3 million Germans who didn't want to be there at all. The territory, however, was incredibly valuable to the Czechs, and without it, the state would fall apart, which it later did. The Lithuanians held Memel, now Klaipėda, where the Germans again weren't happy at all. In both of these latter cases, they were being mistreated. At some point, Hitler wanted them all back home. The first crisis to arrive was not either of these, however, but Austria. Of course, in a German state, Germans weren't being mistreated for their ethnicity, but regardless, the people wanted to come home, and the barriers were beginning to disintegrate. Of these, there was 3 main ones: the Austrian government themselves, Mussolini, and the British. The French at this point didn't really matter so much. Their foreign policy was essentially just aligned to Britain's. The Austrian government was still as determined as ever to keep Austria independent, but this was harder than it sounded. By 1938, the public was absolutely clamouring to be united with Hitler's Germany. Germany had gone from a country in economic ruin to the leader of Europe within the space of 5 years. And the Austrians, as Germans themselves, wanted to be a part of it. Austrian Germans felt that they could be proud of their people again, and patriotic feelings were running high. Many grew sick and tired of the excuses the government kept coming up with for such a union to not occur. The German Germans, I guess you could call them, wanted this union as much as the Austrians. Everyone wanted to be united at last. The other 2 barriers, however, were dissipating. First, there was Mussolini. Mussolini, as mentioned, saw Austria as his buffer state, and had always protected them. Now, him and Hitler were allies. In regards to foreign policy, they agreed to follow the same path. During Mussolini's 1937 visit to Berlin, Hitler had given Mussolini a free hand in the Mediterranean, and in return, supposedly, Mussolini had given way on Austria to Hitler. Mussolini was now no longer a problem. As for the British, this was a more complicated issue, but finally, out of nowhere, there was some light at the end of the tunnel for Hitler. In November 1937, Lord Halifax came to Germany. The reason on paper was to attend a hunt with Goering, but the reality was that he was sent there to meet Hitler, unofficially. Thus why Chamberlain sent him, not his foreign minister, who he trusted far less, Eden. Here, Halifax let the cat out the bag and admitted that in regards to foreign policy in Central Europe, quote, "Possible alterations might be destined to come about with the passage of time," end quote, and continued to say that Britain would not interfere militarily, especially in Austria's case. Hitler at first couldn't believe what he was hearing, but he quickly got the hint. Either Chamberlain had sent Halifax especially to drop this hint so the 2 nations could be reconciled, or Halifax had completely let the cat out the bag. In fact, Eden had warned Halifax not to mention Austria beforehand. Regardless, the message was loud and clear. Hitler, when the opportunity arose regarding Austria, could afford to gamble. Less importantly, but still notably, even France was softening up to Germany. Papen was amazed to note that the French premier and foreign minister, quote, considered a reorientation of French policy in Central Europe as entirely open to discussion, end quote, and that they had, quote, no objection to a marked extension of German influence in Austria, obtained through evolutionary means, end quote. Now, all Hitler had to do was wait. Whilst he essentially had been given permission to take not only Austria, but also the Sudetenland by Halifax, that didn't mean the problem was solved. A crisis would need to arise, and the countries in question would need to, in a way, bring about their own downfall in order for Hitler to take advantage. There could be no giant international incident. Halifax told him that any agreements would need to be, quote, reasonable agreements, reasonably reached. Just declaring war on these countries was not even remotely feasible, and it wasn't even remotely on the cards either. After all, Hitler wanted to incorporate the Germans into his state, not obliterate their land in a bloody war. In 1937, Hitler had instructed the Sudeten Germans to agitate, and logically, in Hitler's mind, he always wanted the Czech question resolved first. In Austria, he did the opposite. He told the National Socialists there not to agitate, and let events take their course. The two were very different cases. Ultimately, however, the Austrian crisis arose first. A.J.P. Taylor describes the Austrian situation at the time in his book, The Origins of the Second World War, at length. Quote, Schuschnigg was still Chancellor of a nominally independent Austria. He had had a sad time of it since making the Gentleman's Agreement of the 11th of July 1936 with Germany. In an innocent, high-minded way, Schuschnigg had assumed that the agreement would end his troubles. Austria would announce her German character. Respectable representatives of the national opposition would enter the Austrian government. Imprisoned Nazis would be released. Then there would be an end of agitation and conspiracies. No more secret arming or illegal propaganda. Schuschnigg was soon disappointed. Nazi agitation went on as before. Not even Hitler's orders could stop it. Schuschnigg's close colleagues themselves intrigued with Berlin against him. He complained to his old patron and protector, Mussolini. He received cold comfort. Mussolini liked to picture himself in a flattering posture as guarantor of Austria's existence, a Metternich in reverse, revenging Italian humiliations of a century before. He listened to the warnings of leading fascists, from his son-in-law Ciano, the foreign minister, downwards, that Hitler was a dangerous associate who would destroy Italy after eating up the others first. He seemed to pay attention, but when it came to the point, he never responded to their promptings. At heart, Mussolini was the only realist in the fascist crew, the only one who appreciated that Italy had little strength of her own, and could simulate greatness only as Hitler's jackal. He might talk of an independent foreign policy, or of asserting Italian interest in Central Europe. He knew that he would have to give way to Hitler if events reached a crisis. He was therefore impatient with Schuschnigg, the man who had to take Mussolini's pretenses seriously. Mussolini, despite his brave talk, was in exactly the same position as the statesmen of Western Europe. He wanted to sell out on Austria, so long as it could be done peacefully and in a decent way. Schuschnigg received no solid backing, only the repeated advice to behave reasonably and to keep things quiet, end quote. In January 1938, the Austrian police raided the local National Socialist headquarters and found detailed plans for another coup. Obviously, Hitler had nothing to do with this, but the only man who could stop them was him. So Schuschnigg reached out to Papen, the German ambassador in Austria, and the man who had gotten Hitler into power in the first place. Papen had resented the Austrian National Socialists undermining his efforts in Austria, and was overjoyed when the evidence was brought before him. Now, in his mind, he could only profit, and he told the Chancellor to bring the evidence to Hitler. Almost immediately afterwards, however, on that same day, February the 4th, 1938, Papen's phone rang, and he was informed that he was being dismissed from his post. The dismissal was nothing to do with this crisis, however, but with an earlier one. In November 1937, Schacht, Minister of Economics, resigned. He had fallen out beyond repair with Hitler, and now the Führer had quite the potential crisis on his hands. 2 months later, however, another opportunity arose, and he was able to profit. To make a long story short, General Blomberg was dismissed from his post for marrying an ex-prostitute, and his potential successor, General Fritsch, was dismissed for most likely false accusations of doing things with children. Now that Hitler got these two anti-Nazis out the way, he took the opportunity to clean house under the cover of the crisis. All the old conservatives who shuffled him into power were now shuffled out. They had brought Hitler into power because they thought they could control him. Now they were cast off into the political wilderness. Papen was the key man amongst all this, conservative schemer number one. With all these firings, Schacht could be thrown in amongst the bunch. The next day, the 5th of February, Papen went off to see Hitler at the Berghof to, quote, obtain some picture of what was going on. When he got there, though, he spoke of the difficulty of the position in Austria and then dropped in the information that Chancellor Schuschnigg wanted to meet Hitler. Hitler immediately went from semi-depressed about the whole Schacht matter to lit up with happiness. Quote, an excellent idea. Please go back to Vienna immediately and arrange for us to meet within the next few days, end quote. Papen meekly protested that he wasn't ambassador anymore, but he was always going to do as he was told, and after a little insisting from Hitler, he was convinced and went off to do it immediately. On the 7th of February, Schuschnigg jumped on the opportunity, given that this whole thing was his idea anyway, and by the 12th, he was at the Berghof. On the way, he had already seen an ominous sign of things to come. At the border, the German officials raised their right arms to salute him. Then, the Austrians did the same, which was completely against the law. He arrived with the idea that he would play the victim, which indeed he was if the Austrian Nazis were planning a coup in Austria. This wasn't Hitler's problem, however, and his promise to not interfere had been kept. It was the Austrian Nazis who were refusing orders. Regardless, in he went to meet Hitler, and his plan immediately backfired. Hitler, as we know, was a gambler. He chose attack rather than defence, and he immediately put Schuschnigg on the back foot. The Austrian Chancellor was berated with accusations and overwhelmed. Hitler accused him of breaking the gentleman's agreement the two had come to. Quote, I can tell you right now, Herr Schuschnigg, that I am absolutely determined to make an end of all this. The German Reich is one of the great powers, and nobody will raise his voice if it settles its border problems. End quote. At one point, he even called in his generals as if to suggest that something bad might happen if the Chancellor refused his demands, which he duly laid out. Seyss Inquart, a man with obvious National Socialist and German nationalist sympathies, must be made Minister of the Interior, and the control of the Austrian police force must be handed over to him. Austria was to coordinate her economic and foreign policy with that of Germany. Schuschnigg protested that he couldn't agree to such things without the consent of the government, and most importantly, the president. Hitler respected this, but things continued to remain heated. Quote, I am telling you once more that things cannot go on this way. I have a historic mission, and this mission I will fulfill, because Providence has destined me to do so. I thoroughly believe in this mission. It is my life. Look around you in Germany today, Herr Schuschnigg, and you will find that there is but one will. I am carried along by the love of my people. I can go about freely and without guard at any time in Germany, and that's because I am born by the love and trust of my people, end quote. He then went on to mock the Chancellor for trying to fortify the border between their two nations. Quote, you don't seriously believe you can stop me, or even delay me for half an hour, do you? Perhaps you will wake up one morning in Vienna to find us there, just like a spring storm, and then you'll see something. I would very much like to save Austria from such a fate, because such an action would mean blood, end quote. The Führer then began to remind Schuschnigg that no one else would come to Austria's aid, whilst the Chancellor claimed the opposite. Quote, think it over, Herr Schuschnigg, think it over well. I can only wait until this afternoon. If I tell you that, you will do well to take my words literally. I don't believe in bluffing. All my past is proof of that, end quote. Then the meeting broke up for lunch, and in front of others, Hitler treated his guest kindly, and the mood was relaxed and cordial. The truth was, however, Hitler was bluffing, as he always had done, and always would do. Hitler's rearmament program had been a bluff. The truth was, the Allies were rearming much faster. The Rhineland was a bluff. He had no means of backing up such a move with military force. Now, the Führer was bluffing again, but would Schuschnigg fall into the trap? As always, the answer appeared to be yes. Far later in the afternoon, Hitler finally saw the Chancellor again, and shoved a written draft agreement in his face. Quote, I have decided to make one last attempt. There is nothing to be discussed about it. I will not change one single iota. You will either sign it as it stands, or else our meeting has been useless. In that case, I shall decide during the night what shall be done next, end quote. Essentially, the agreement amounted to a gigantic step forward on the path of Austria losing its independence, and the entire thing was based on bluff. There was no plan of Germany invading. Germany was in no state to do so, but regardless, the Austrian Chancellor did not know this. Despite the crazy atmosphere that he did not expect, he did get what he came there for, and given Austria's current state, Seyss Inquart's inclusion in the cabinet was no worse than others that were there at the time. The two men were even boyhood friends, although some of the other inclusions stung a little. He also gained a vital concession from Hitler. The Austrian Nazis' illegal activities were repudiated, and Hitler said that any unwanted Austrians should transfer their residence to the Reich. Regardless, in the moment, the Chancellor was incredibly shaken, and his cigarette addiction wasn't helping. He was expressly forbidden to smoke in front of Hitler, and whenever he got a spare moment outside, he would immediately begin chain-smoking the stress away. This time, Hitler called Keitel into the room, and simply told him to sit and wait, as if intimidating the Chancellor again. Soon after this, he went outside, and Schuschnigg, badly shaken, rushed to meet his foreign minister. He said to him that he would not be surprised if the two were arrested in the next 5 minutes. Then, out of nowhere, Hitler met him again, and he was suddenly seeming benevolent. "I have decided to change my mind, for the first time in my entire life, but I warn you, this is your very last chance. I have given you 3 more days before the agreement goes into effect," end quote. Schuschnigg immediately signed, and was overjoyed at this moderate concession. Hitler said, quote, "Believe me, Herr Bundeskanzler, it is for the best. Now we can abide by this agreement for the next 5 years," end quote. Schuschnigg rushed back to Austria and set about getting the document approved with Papen and Schmidt, his foreign minister. Papen said, quote, "Now you have some idea, Herr Bundeskanzler, how difficult it is for me to deal with such an unstable person," end quote, and then assured Schuschnigg that next time would be different. Quote, "You know the Führer can be absolutely charming," end quote. Schuschnigg wondered to himself if there would even be a next time. Back in Austria, the news spread quickly amongst the famous coffee houses of Vienna, and an uneasy feeling spread over the nation. Many felt the time was finally coming to unite. Those that wanted no part in it began to panic. The cabinet began to splinter into 2 camps. One thought the Chancellor was right to follow his policy of caution. The other felt that he should publicly announce Hitler's brutal tactics at the Berghof to the world. The reality was, however, everyone could bicker as much as they wanted. But now, only 24 hours were remaining on Hitler's ultimatum, which was, of course, a bluff. An emergency conference was called in the president's office with the mayor of Vienna, the president of the National Bank, and others in attendance. Schuschnigg presented them with 3 options. Option 1. Select a new chancellor, who would be under no obligation to follow Hitler's agreement. 2. Follow the agreement under Schuschnigg. 3. Follow the agreement under a new chancellor. The Austrians were clearly out of their depth, and the meeting was a complete panicked mess. Ridiculous ideas were floated, such as a proposal to cede Braunau, Hitler's birthplace, to Germany. These men clearly did not understand Hitler at all. However, with mock German military maneuvers at the border, the men eventually bowed to the pressure and agreed to allow Schuschnigg to accept the pact agreed at the Berghof. The public, as mentioned, was splitting into 2 camps. The second camp, those who feared a German invasion, were rather obvious. Perhaps the most obvious of all, though, was the Austrian Jewish population, which was extensive. The German legation reported back home that Vienna resembled an anthill. Thousands of Jews were preparing to emigrate, and many others were trying to apply pressure to prevent the whole thing from going ahead however they could. They knew that German integration would result in a death sentence for their businesses or position in the world. Influential Jews began to pull their money out of the stock market, and the market tanked as a result, as rich Jews took their money